if you look at Baltimore's policy the past 30, 25 years, it's been heavy policing, tax breaks to developers. I mean, that was what was outlined in RoboCop, right? They wanted to build this new shiny city, the new economy that would all be managed by private firms. Neoliberalism. What do they need but the most effective, brutal police officer they could find? In other words, i.e., who wasn't even human, but was created by a corporation. I mean, if you can't find like the ultimate propaganda, and the neoliberal policy was enforced by a robot with who could absorb bullshit. Anyway, I could go on about RoboCop for years. I mean,
yes, don't get them
but
started.
it is that formula. You see, Baltimore's had the same formula: hyper aggressive policing, tax breaks to developers. We'll build Harbor East. We'll build Harbor Point with tax breaks for these developers. Meanwhile, we'll have the police in poor neighborhoods arresting 100,000 people a year. It's like they predicted the future, in my opinion.
Can I just say one more thing, though? When you brought up RoboCop, I got stuck in that sci-fi supernatural loop again when I realized how many of the shows I loved were actually infected by policing. And when I realized it's fed to us on another level. So RoboCop, I think, is a somewhat more obvious for those who have the eyes to see it. It's a critique, but there are a lot of other forms of propaganda that are like warm and fuzzy. And I don't just mean like Andy Griffith. There's shows like Eureka. There's shows like The Rookie. There's shows where the cops are like lovable and quirky, like Brooklyn 911, so there are all these shows. There's even time traveling cops, like there's time cops. So these shows that are constantly humanizing police officers, making them friendly, making them lovable.
But you're excluding the most accurate show, Reno 911.
That one is
that's the most accurate.
That was an honest critique. That's why I didn't.
That's cinema verite. That's actually one of my favorites.
But they have all these, so they have all these angles that Copaganda is working on us. We have the angle where the police officer always gets his man. So it's that myth of efficacy. We have the police officer always being logical and doing the right thing, which can be anything from Dragnet to RoboCop, that they are not affected by, emotions like the rest of us. Judge Dredd. So that they have a higher calling, and that they're somehow above the emotional influences that we have, so that they can mete out true justice. Then they have the aspect of, and then when they have to step beyond that logic, it's for good reasons, because that bureaucratic red tape, it's because of that ACLU lawyer. And so it's okay for them to break the rules. So there are all these different lessons that were being taught from these different forms of propaganda. And the worst part about the supernatural propaganda and the sci-fi propaganda is that those cops are literally the dividing line between evil and good. And Sleepy Hollow, our hero cop, played by Nicole Beharie, she is literally protecting us from hell. She's literally protecting us from an apocalypse. She's literally standing between us and damnation. That is the supernatural foundation of the show. So the way that we're given that cops are able to literally be the dividing line, the only line protecting us, the good from the evil. Think of how many years you've been soaking that in since a child.
Right. Right. I mean, and it's this is the conversation that I always point to. And, again, I'm going to thank Hyden, because the day he did the show, the interview with Jared, and he pointed out that people in crime-ridden neighborhoods who believe that you need police officers because they live in a place where shootings are real, carjackings are real, all these things are real. How do you have to be able to have a reasonable conversation with these people that explains why their whole basis of analysis for what they believe policing is actually about has nothing to do with reality.
You just don't read, beloved.
It is literally all about the things that we are consistently told over and over again about what policing actually is. And none of that is based in the reality of what policing is. And one of the things that I think also is missing vastly is how much crime police officers commit.
Yeah.
Right? Like how many times the person who is in the domestic violence is a police officer, when they they go in and they steal things from people when they're supposed to be investigating a crime, but they find money in a corner and they steal it. Like all the things that they are involved in, which are actually literally on the criminal side of society that no one thinks about, no one pays attention to, no one, addresses. And it's all lost, right? Like we're being over policed by a group of people for whom there's a large enough population of them who are actually committing crimes that they should have nothing to do with policing society.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're kind of agnostic to the idea of notion of police corruption, because I don't think there is such a thing in the sense that policing simply reflects the corruption of the society that it's tied to. Like, in Baltimore, policing reflects the inequality, the racism, the segregation, the social isolation. It's not police corruption. Police are behaving exactly the way the system is designed to behave. They are infected by the same corruption that the premise of Baltimore, the entire economic structure of Baltimore is premised upon. So they're just behaving in the ways with the incentives within that system. I think, because I think the problem with police corruption is saying that, well, if they're just good actors in this policing system, it would be okay. And I don't think that's true. I think the way, when you see what you're talking about, the phenomenon, when you have stuff like the gun trace task force, I don't think they were as exceptional as people wanted to make them out to be. In fact, my problem with that whole idea is that they're trying to say, here are these 7 horrible rogue cops. That stuff was going on for years, all the time.
Yes,
I reported on it quite extensively over and over again in places I worked. Everybody ignored it. It just happened to be at that moment they sort of crystallized it. But I think plenty of people were doing that. There were quotas for making arrests. People were stealing overtime. They're probably still stealing overtime. So, yeah, you're right. But it's like almost like it becomes a criminal enterprise in and of itself in some sense.
Can I just add to that? You remember earlier I was talking about the clearance rate. Well, as we know, in most cities, and especially in my city, Baltimore, those stats, getting those numbers to show, look how many cases we closed, look how many cases we cleared. Well, that creates a perverse incentive because the police department wants to look good. The police officer wants to get promotions and look like he or she is doing their job. And so when you were talking about crimes committed by police officers, my mind went to the crimes committed by police officers in order to put people in jail, to get the statistics, to get the numbers they need. And for example, we were there to cover Alfred Chestnut, Watkins, and Mr. Ransom getting out of prison after 30 years. They were 16 years old. It was Thanksgiving Day when they were taken to prison for a shooting. It was in the 80s. It was a big deal. It was a shooting over a starter jacket. Turned out that another child, an 18-year-old, had been identified as a shooter by multiple people. However, they suppressed that evidence. They suppressed multiple forms of evidence. And 30 years later, because of the Maryland Innocence Project and what SAO Mosby was doing at the time, these men were exonerated after losing 30 years of their life.
36.
Thank you. 36 years of their life.
And there were detectives in that. David Simon had written about. He'd written about the case. He had written about the case, right?
Right. He had written about the case with the detective Kincaid. And Kincaid, when spoken to again about arresting those young men, was absolutely unrepentant. But that case with Alfred Chestnut and his 2 friends is not a one-off. There are so many cases where people have had decades of their life stolen because officers have suppressed exculpatory evidence, forced false confessions, even manufactured evidence. So the crimes against
or intentionally pin somebody with a crime they didn't do in order to protect somebody that they didn't want to go to jail for it. It's just wild.
This is just me anecdotally speaking, and this is part of the Copaganda. I mean,
and Stephen, real quick before, just know
sure.
we have a time limit, so we
got a hard out at 1 o'clock.
Okay, no, I just
want 1 o'clock. Yeah, sorry.
I just want to really quickly raise the issue that since Marilyn Mosby left office and Ivan Bates, I think that whole process has stopped of reviewing convictions.
The conviction review unit. I haven't heard much from them since
Unbelievable.
under Bates.
Saturday with Renee.